Hey guys, this is Infinite Flash here. Today I'm going to be talking about the second game of round 5 of the Sinquefield Cup. We have Levon Aronian playing Magnus Carlsen in this game. Aronian playing white, Carlsen playing black, and no introductions are needed about the world champion and the former number 2 rated player in the world. And in this game, we started off with d4 by Aronian. Aronian almost always plays d4, knight f6 by Carlsen, knight f3, and in this position we kind of get a somewhat unusual move with an early b6. Certainly black can play e6 or g6 or any of them standard move, d5, whatever. But he plays b6, and this opening is kind of flexible with an early knight f3 here. I mean, certainly after c4 and b6 is also possible, but I don't think Carlsen would have played it after c4. So in this position, Aronian just tries to, let's say, oppose this diagonal with his own bishop with g3, and after bishop b7, c4, he can play bishop g2 anytime he wants. It doesn't really matter. g6, bishop b6, bishop g2, bishop g7. We have a double fianchetto opening by black. Castles, castles. And in this position, there's kind of an interesting point is, whenever white plays knight c3, black always has this knight e4 move, trading off the knight, and there's no discovery with the knight here like knight h4 because black actually has the more important attacker here, attacking the queen, and you're always forced to take the knight, and black gets to exchange the bishops here, and it's really, really fine. So, instead of that, he played instead of knight c3, he just played rook e1 and aims to push e4 at some point, but it's very, very difficult to get in. Black just continued with e6, and if white really wants to play e4, he can play bishop g5 and just take the knight off, but I think just after h6, forcing the bishop to decide where it wants to go, bishop takes and queen takes e4, and I mean black has many flexible setups with probably c5, allowing white to play d5, d6, e5, and this normal King's Indian. And although this bishop would look bad, say, in that hypothetical structure, after, let's just put a few moves on the board, in this kind of structure, black can always, let's say, put the bishop back here and help the f5 pawn break. And black is generally okay. That, of course, white won't play that structure, but black is very, very flexible, and he's the bishop pair, so he's completely fine in this position, even though white has the center. So going back, instead of bishop g5, I think Carlsen or Aronian played knight c3 and ended up allowing knight e4, trading off the piece here. And instead of allowing the capture here, he just took here himself, and after knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, played bishop g5, gaining a tempo on the queen. Black doesn't really want to play bishop f6. Kind of just bringing out this bishop to an awkward square, and he doesn't really want to play f6, weakening the structure, so he decided to move the queen. Queen c8 looks a little bit weird, but at least queen e8 keeps kind of contact with the center, and kind of, yeah, just keeps contact with the center, and just protects a lot of these pawns around the center of the board. White played queen d2, connecting his rooks, and probably playing bishop h6, trying to just trade off the dark squared bishop, since the rook can't move because the queen is occupying the only square that it could go to before the queen was on d8. And after d6, probably planning some future e5 break or c5 break, and also this d6 move just controls these squares, which is very, very important when it comes to moves like such as knight e5 or at any point. White continued with this let's say trading off the dark sword bishop's plan, and we kind of get a very, very quiet middle game where white has a space advantage, but he can't really do anything with it really, and black moved the queen back here and got a couple trades here, and nothing much is happening. And I guess one interesting moment is here. Black has the option of taking here, and he probably plans to move the knight here, so this bishop doesn't really have a plan. And if black, let's say, takes, after e takes, he has really, really strong pressure on this pawn, and annoying moves such as f4 and d5 trying to gnaw away at the pawn structure are very, very uncomfortable for black to deal with. So he wouldn't take the knight. In the game, he played knight f6, just continuing development, and in this position, white decided to move the knight away. and kind of leave the bishop on its own. So in this position, you can already think about, not in this position specifically, but you can think about moves like such as d5, locking the bishop within the pawn structure here, and this kind of just feels unsafe for white if he that just kind of leaves for black. I mean, if he kind of just leaves this bishop, so Carlsen just decided to drop back the bishop, and he's really, really totally fine in this position. And Aronian just decided to continue with f3, followed by e4, getting some space in the center, and Carlsen decided to play c5, counterattacking the center, and we saw e4 by white, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, and we have let's say a hedgehog structure that you can kind of expect all of the pawns are here in the 6th rank, and black is very, very solid in this position, and can hope for attacking the center squares, and there's always this weak diagonal here and this weak diagonal here with the weak structure over here, and his aim is for black's aim is to try to get b5 and d5 in this kind of position. And in this position he continues rook fd8, trying to play d5. White played knight g2, and I think after d5 probably there's c takes, and after e takes I think there's e5, closing the position. And this position is very, very pleasant given that the bishop controls the c8 square, and white is clearly better after probably just f4 and probably knight e3, and it just looks very, very nice for white. If I have a kind of a nasally voice, I'm sorry guys, I'm got some allergies over here, as every human does. Unlike these guys who play like computers. Ah ha ha. So in this position, we saw white play knight g2, and in this position, black played queen c7, repositioning the queen, getting some pressure on the pawn. White played knight e3, protecting the pawn, controlling the d5 square, and trying to prevent this d5 move by black. Black played queen c5, trying to reduce the pressure over here, and white doesn't really want a queen trade, and if he queen trades, I suspect that either capture is fine, but more natural is just d takes, and black controls the d5 square. He has the open d file, and he's really, really okay, given that this bishop doesn't really have any active prospects against this pawn, and kind of biting on the pawn. Black's really fine in this position. So instead of just taking the queen, he just dropped it back, and his idea is a b4 at some point, but black decided to prevent b4 in this position with the nice move a5. Kind of opens this idea with bishop a6 with the rook allowing the, let's say, protected, and I think black is really fine in this position. Let's say so in this position, white decided to continue the pressure on the d pawn with rook e1. As you can see, it's like really, really slow positional maneuvering, and there's not much to really say about each side. But all the moves are really, really logical, and it's about equal in this kind of position. Although white has a space advantage, it's not really clear how to take advantage of it, and because there's not really much pressure to be had, black can easily defend, and it'll take a while to make any kind of progress. And after rook e1, we can kind of see Carlsen just believing that white doesn't really have that much in this position. He played h5, kind of a space gaining move, possibly playing h4 at some point, and this kind of keeps his options open. If white wants to play f4, he can always jump with the knight over here on g4. So, and f4 kind of looks is going to be probably played at some point, not right now, but later on in the game. So this is kind of a useful waiting move. White played rook d3, probably playing this move, and after he plays b3, this queen probably wants to be kind of, let's say, extra supported. So kind of makes sense. Also kind of protecting the knight here, and as I mentioned, getting some pressure on the d file is pretty nice. Black in this position played b5, and probably if I was white, I would have just taken the pawn here, and after queen takes b5, I don't know, queen d2, trying to get pressure over here, and I don't know, bishop a6, trying to take over here, and bishop f1. Sample line like this is really, really okay for both sides. I don't think white doesn't, I don't think white is really having much. Black is getting d5 in and really has no problems. I mean, I would have still played that and preferred that over the game continuation with b3, where black gets this isolated pawn to attack over here, and after bishop c6, the game is probably roughly equal, given that black has a weakness and white has a weakness. And after rook cd1, getting a little bit more pressure, black just defended and probably prepares this move, or kind of keeps his options open with a move like rook d7. Can also switch over here at some point. white brought the bishop back here to, let's say, overprotect the pawn structure over here. There's always these worry tactics of knight e4 and followed by bishop takes e4, and the rook would be attacked, and there's always this nice diagonal to be had with, and not in this specific position, but this is just a nice position for the bishop. Also, since the bishop was on h3, it wasn't doing that much anyway, so it kind of makes sense to reposition the bishop here. In this position, Carlsen just kind of repositioned the rook over here, taking the open file, and I think yeah, in this position, white didn't really see anything better with trying to take advantage of the d pawn. He just played queen d4, trying to, let's say, trade off some pieces, since he has the weak c4 pawn, weak a2 pawn, and the slightly weak kingside structures, the bad bishop, technically speaking, and he has a really nice knight, but that's pretty much it for white in this position. And black decided to play queen e5, and in this position, white played the, let's say, the slightly off move with f4, but it's nothing too bad, and black just decided to take the queen, and we got this endgame where at first you kind of look at this and say, isn't white kind of better with the strong pressure against the d pawn? Well, the problem is black always has pressure on this e4 pawn, and it's really, really annoying to play as a white. And in this kind of position, I think instead of what Carlsen played is with rook c7 followed by rook d2, he could probably go for e5 in this position, and I think white's best try for to, let's say, to play the position is just taking the pawn here, and after d takes rook, and bishop here, the knight jumps to d5, and the position is really, really okay for white. Although black has got the advantage in the pawn structure here, given the weak c4 pass pawn, but white has definitely got some counterplay here, and also he can kind of jump with his rook to the b2 square, trying to get active here. And I think with the pawn structure here, with the bishop kind of biting on the square, black is let's say slightly better in this position, but it's nothing too serious. Obviously, what Carlsen played is fine as well, but e5 was just another option. In the game, he played rook c7, and after rook d2, defending against this rook b2 idea, Carlsen just decided to overprotect d8 and kind of just kind of play the game. I don't know, like, let's say continue the game, and there's not much to do for either side, and it's just kind of a waiting game. Both sides just are improving their pieces, and I guess this is the critical moment of the game. Aronian in this position goes absolutely bananas, and he grew tired of just playing this slow, patient maneuvering game. And in this position, he makes the in my opinion, just a move I would have never considered, c5, and I guess his idea was that after pawn takes, which was played, to play rook c4 and try to collect the pawn, but the problem is Carlsen played bishop b5, and he can't really take the pawn. Also, another option was rook d7, and this rook is under attack, and I mean, it's really difficult to play. I guess the only move is really maybe rook takes here, and one other option is probably rook here, trying to get pressure against the pawn here, but maybe just knight d6 with this idea to capture the pawn here if with bishop takes e4, and black would be up a pawn here, and I guess there's not really much else than rook dc2. If he takes the rook here, then just bishop takes, and I think, or actually not bishop takes, he would insert this check first, and I mean this a pawn is falling after the rook is here, and I mean it's just difficult to recommend anything. If I think if king f3, then bishop takes rook, and I think white is going to be down to the pawn at the end of that line, and I mean if white tries to, let's say, rook trade here, I think just takes, bishop takes, and black has the extra pawn, and is probably a little bit better. It's not really clear if he can win the game, given the white king is going to come over here and try to annoy you, but you can probably start out with e5, putting one less pawn on the light squares, and black can play knight c7, and black has good chances to improve the position and make use of his extra pawn. So clearly c5 is, I don't know what to say, it's a kind of a blackout for black. That was another weird pun I just made, blackout, weird. maybe a whiteout. Another weird pawn. He had some whiteout there. Anyways, that was just a pawn drop in my opinion, with pawn takes here, and after rook c4, rook d7. Uh, Wrong move. Sorry about this, guys. Oh my god, so bad, so bad. Rook c4, bishop b5, played by Carlsen, kicking this rook away, and I think after rook c3, he just pushed the pawn, and after e5, it's at least he opens up the bishop here, but black just keeps onto the pawn and tries to hold on to it, as we can see, and probably instead of knight c2, you can also try to play bishop f1 and try to pressure the pawn here, and probably after this, black just has to defend the pawn like a madman, and white would probably just have to blockade it and defend it like try to attack it like a madman, and knight c7, and maybe Aronian was afraid of this kind of variation where white attempts to give the pawn back but activates his knight here, and has really strong pressure on the piece. I mean, white should be fine, but it's really uncomfortable to play this kind of position. I would obviously prefer black there. And in the game, Aronian just played knight c2. This is probably a really solid move, just keeping his options open, blocking the c pawn still, and kind of waiting for black to make his move in a way, and just see how you can improve the position. Bringing the king up to, let's say, support a piece going to d4 is also another idea in this position that needs kind of the strong consideration. Knight c7 was played by black, trying to play knight d5, and in this position, white could certainly play knight e3, further pressuring the position, but I think he just wanted to play knight d4, and after knight d5, this is a really strong knight, so white just decided to capture it, and I think after e takes d5, there's annoying pressure here with rook b2, if I recall correctly, and after, let's say, a subsequent rook here maybe, and rook here, this is a really annoying position to play for black. He didn't really want to take with the pawn there. He wanted to play rook here and kind of keep an eye on the knight here without letting the knight sit here with the pawn on d5. Pawn takes looks more natural, but it's a kind of a nice blockade with the knight there. And after rook takes d5, white just decided to retreat the knight. I mean, there's not much better. He wants to get one more piece off the board, so he can try to take advantage of the weak pawn with this active king coming. If, let's say, rook takes d2 and knight takes d2, you can kind of see this king running over here and helping and assisting in the defense. Probably there's always rook d8 in that kind of position, but that's just an idea I'm talking about. And yeah, knight f3. Black just decided to play rook c5, keeping one piece on the board, and yeah, in this position, instead of rook c5, he can also definitely consider rook here, defending us, and after king e3, both sides can bring their kings to the center, and play continues, and black is up a pawn. It's not so easy how to push it, given the rook is in a nice position here. I think play is pretty unclear, but black is definitely doing very well. But white has good chances to blockade it and draw, in my opinion. So he took there, knight f3, rook not there, rook c5 he played, just keeping the rooks on. And this rook also has the d6 square, but it doesn't really do much, given that black is really is pretty solid in this kind of position. And we saw rook b2 trying to take advantage of this, let's say, this rook over here. So Carlsen immediately got out of the pin here. Just did not want any business of, let's say, this kind of maneuver over here, trying to pressure the bishop with the rook kind of into it. And in this position, white brought the knight back over here. He can also consider bringing the rook over here, kind of just shuffling around and hoping to draw here in this kind of position. And after rook d5, just kind of building up the d file. I mean, there's not really much else black can do in this kind of position. And in this kind of position, we kind of get the same kind of a transposition really to that other line I was talking about. Not really clear, again, what each side is trying to do in that kind of position. You can investigate that if you want. But instead of rook d2, white played knight d2, and I guess he's trying to put more pressure on the pawn, possibly knight e4, and jumping on these dark squares over here. But the only, I guess this is a fine move, but black played bishop c6, kind of getting this open diagonal, stopping knight e4. And I guess one idea is that there's not knight takes c4 because of rook d4 probably, or yeah, probably rook d4. And there's annoying pressure here with bishop d5. Let's see, knight takes c4, rook here. Yeah, and I think this is really annoying. And there's always this idea of bishop a4 probably. Bishop a4 probably. Well, this doesn't look that bad for white, but you know, he didn't want to really let white activate his knight. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'm just being a really silly guy right now. I think after knight takes here, I just missed bishop d5 for the longest time, and this is actually just winning a piece. Shame on me. And black wins actually. Oh my god. So that was kind of a blooper for me. Nice job. And in this position, black, you can kind of see this rook opposing this rook, and this rook is kind of undefended. So white relied on this, let's say, pin right over here on the pawn, on yet another pin, by the way. And in this position, we just saw black back up the rook here, relying on his own pin. So we got a couple pins working here, really weirdly. White decided to, let's say, drop back the rook, and you know, threaten the rook over here. So now that the rook is protected over here, and black pushed the pawn here because it's hanging. And I guess one tactic is that just knight takes e5 is met by pawn takes here, and black promotes. So white's got to drop back the rook, and I think black just moved his rook. And you know, after rook takes c3, we got this big simplification into a position where black is likely getting the a pawn here, and we're going to get probably a one rook endgame. And I guess this is what happened in the game when Aronian tried to jettison the pawn over here, trying to activate his rook on the 7th rank, or try to activate it somewhere over here, getting really nice activity. And I think this is what happened. Oh, not a takes b3. Aronian just decided rook takes here. Also a fine move. There's nothing wrong with a takes, I think, but the double rook endgames are not much different from this single rook endgame. But I guess this is a really tedious endgame to defend against Carlsen, who's known as one of the best endgame players in the world. And I mean, he just works wonders and somehow wins in these kind of positions. So Aronian started out with rook c8, which is not a bad move. I think it's quite a fine move. King e7, and after king g2, he's got to keep the eye on the h2 pawn. I guess another move was just rook a8 and try to keep the pawn just behind the rook behind the pawn, and black would probably have to defend in this kind of position. I'm not really sure. Black already has like options to play other moves, but it's nothing that serious. I mean, he can play rook b5, but I'm not really sure about if you want to play the rook here rather than here to, let's say, support the pawn. You can never really advance if the rook is over here, so rook a3 makes a lot of sense. Notice that you don't want to play a move like rook b2, king f3, and rook takes h2, trying to trade off this pawn for this pawn, because this is kind of a theoretical draw with 3 versus 4, and black is, although black has a pawn advantage, this is really no problem for white to try to draw. So Carlsen's got to keep the a pawn on the board if he wants to try to win, in my opinion. And you know, let's see, rook b2. Oh, as I was saying, rook a3. Yeah, in this position, I think white would just continue king g2, rook a3, rook a2. And you know, the king goes over here to defend the h2 pawn. Pretty decently active, and I'm not really sure what black doesn't specifically in this position. Maybe he pushes the a pawn. You can try to bring the king over here to try to support the a4 pawn, a5 pawn, but if he does this, then probably white can just give it the h2 pawn, and after check, king g5. It's really unclear what you should do in this position. White is activating his king, and you know, the a pawn is hanging, and this is really annoying to play for black. At least annoying counterplay. Clearly, you know, black is better in that position I was talking about, but you know, white is getting at least activity there. So going back to this position, instead of rook a8, you know, Aronian just decided to play his king over here and kind of switch up the move order, and this is fine. But black gets to push a4, and with the rook over there, black still had to play like rook here immediately, and in this position, I think Aronian definitely should play rook a8 again, just focusing on blockading the pawn or stopping the pawn. I mean, and after a3, king h3, king d7, and you kind of get the same idea where if black really has to, if he wants to try to win, he has to support the pawn, but white is getting all these pawns over here, and he should be actually winning in this kind of case because black is trying for a win, but it's really difficult to find anything for black to really make progress in this position. You might have to end up taking the a3 pawn for the h2 pawn, making this kind of a drawish position. That's what white should play. If you guys can find a win in this kind of position, winning plan for black in this kind of position, I'd be really amazed, but I don't really see it. Instead of a3, you can also play, let's say, rook b4 instead of a3. I mean, and in this position, probably king h3, and black can probably try g5 in this position, trying to break open the pawn structure. And after a move such as f takes g5, rook g4, very similar to what happened in the game, by the way. To try to, let's say, round up the e5 pawn after you maneuver the king over here to take the g5 pawn. Rook a5, king f8, and white's just making, let's say, waiting moves till, or probably just takes, and after takes. You get this kind of structure where black has pretty decent winning chances, but it still should be drawn, given it's really tough to win these kind of endgames, these rook endgames. But I think Carlsen might have been able to pull a fast one on Aronian in that kind of position. So going back, instead of rook a8, he just ended up playing king h3. And after this, black played the strong move g5, breaking up the pawn structure, making the e5 pawn weak. And after f takes g, we saw the strong move by Carlsen, rook b4, playing rook g4, and putting white into a sort of a zugzwang. And this is really tough to play for white. And he just played rook a8 finally, and blockade, kind of not blockade, but just keep an eye on the pawn. And black played rook g4, and white is absolutely he has the checks here with that kind of counterplay, but he doesn't really have any constructive plan, but just to wait for black to make progress. And we saw check, king here, and I guess in order to open up this rank, he just gave up the pawn anyway, knowing that this was lost anyway. So he allowed this kind of transformation of the position. And after pawn takes pawn, king g2, Carlsen continued with g5, and after king f3, rook b4. I mean, white is suffering a lot in this kind of position, but at least he has opportunities to at least get active here. And Carlsen made a lot of progress compared to, let's say, this position. Starting off, I mean, if you told him that if you told him that he could get the following position from this position, I think he would have taken it, given that at least he has the pass pawn and has the opportunity to, let's say, create a weakness over here. And even though his king is not that active, he at least has the e5 pawn to target. So I think this is a pretty big success for Carlsen, at least making this much progress. And in this position, he played kind of a waiting move, king e8, and I think white played an okay move in king d3. And after h4, we saw, I think, king c3 attacking the rook here, and we saw pawn takes pawn, relying on g2 promotion if king takes b4, so he's got to recapture here. Rook g4, and after this move, I think Aronian just blundered in this position. He unfortunately, Aronian's just having a miserable tournament, blundering random games away. Yesterday in Caruana's game, we saw him didn't take the knight over here, and he got positionally dismantled. And in this game, he's making a lot of simple blunders like c5. That was a bit ridiculous. And in this position, he played the very unfortunate king d3, which I think loses the game. Instead, he should play king d2, kind of staying up rook takes g3. And in this position, black really doesn't have any better than probably just taking. And after rook takes a4, king f7, rook a6, keeping an eye on the a6 pawn. White has pretty decent chances to at least draw this position compared to the other position. This is heaven. And king d3 came, and unfortunately he missed a3, and the idea is that rook takes a3 is met by rook takes g3, and this is a skewer right here, unfortunately for white. So after this, Aronian is pretty much lost and allowed the following moves to be played, and there's not much counterplay as black has the 2 pawns over here, and really has no chance to really stop either of them. Whenever the rook leaves one of them, the other pushes themselves, and black won the game. Carlsen won the game very, very handily, very easily, I mean. So going back, I mean, Aronian was doing quite alright, I mean, until this pretty ridiculous move with c5. He should just continue waiting this position. I'm not really sure with what, maybe bishop f1 or maneuvering the king further to support the center. Very, very unclear, but after this, I don't know, he just miscalculated something and his position went downhill, and he had some chances along the way to save himself, but psychologically speaking, this is very, very difficult when you accidentally dropped a pawn over here and you just realize that black is holding on to it, and you go into this kind of pawn ending, and even though it might be drawable, it's very, very tough coming back from, let's say, this kind of position. You're always kind of nagging at yourself for having a very, very nice space advantage, and to go to this kind of rook endgame is, let's say, torture, and it's just straining on you, and you're just kind of disappointed and mad at yourself. So anyways, guys, Aronian just has a depressing loss here. Is just having a depressing tournament with, I think, 3 straight losses against MBL, Caruana, and Carlsen here. It's just a very sad affair. At least Carlsen wins, so the world #1 is rebounding from his loss against Caruana and a draw yesterday against Topalov. Anyways, guys, hope you liked this video. I know it was a bit long, but kind of there was a little bit of stuff and instructive stuff here and there. And I'll be seeing you around. I'll be posting the MVL versus Topalov game soon enough. Thanks for watching.